Now, the average person like myself only needs a string trimmer to run well enough so that it can do its job. However, for someone else, they might want it to run at tip-top shape, which there's nothing wrong with. But when you're fixing that trimmer for someone else, most would say to make sure that it's running at its best. However, you're about to see why that might be a really tall order to make happen. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this very orange string trimmer, and the problem is that it runs. However, it's not running very smoothly. Now, the last time this very orange string trimmer was here, we found out that it would start, but it wouldn't stay running. We ended up getting it to run only after making some slight adjustments to the carb. However, it wasn't close to perfect. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, most of the comments from the last video said it'd be best to go through the carb and do a full service. But of course, the decision would be left to the owner of the trimmer, and luckily they also agreed to do a full service. Mainly because they seem to like it a lot and wanted to continue to use it for a long time, which seems to be the consensus with this brand. Now, before we tear into this trimmer, I want to start it up and show you the problem it's having. And maybe it'll give you an idea if it is the same problem you're having with yours. So it does run, and for most people, it's more than good enough to use, but as you also heard, it seems to not be able to keep a constant engine speed when at full throttle. Now, the most likely reason for this is that the diaphragm inside the carb that controls fuel flow is having some problems working like it should. And because of the type of fuel being used and partly due to some neglect, these diaphragms will begin to harden up, causing this issue. Now, the diaphragm is right under this metal plate, and it's going to be stuck to it as well. Now, to get a better look at it, it's best to remove it along with the gasket for it. Now, the gasket for the diaphragm is going to get in the way of a good inspection, so we'll need to carefully separate it and then look at the diaphragm. And even though this one is not completely petrified like a piece of cardboard, it's also not as flexible as it should be. There's also a couple of large wrinkles in this diaphragm, and those are definitely going to affect how it works. So after taking off the pumping section, the first item we need to check is the inlet screen for any sort of debris buildup. And if there is some debris buildup on the screen, you'll have to clean it off, and also later on check the fuel filter in the tank. I like to use carb cleaner to do this part, but I've heard that you can use other types of cleaners as well. Now, from what I can tell about this carb, I think someone must have tried to clean it a while ago but neglected to replace this diaphragm. That, and it seemed like this carb was working just fine except for good fuel control, which is why it's so important to replace this diaphragm. I'm also going to throw that old diaphragm into my rejuvenation bath just on the off chance that it can be saved for a later project. The solution in the bath will make the diaphragm soft and make it usable again, which could help out in a situation where I've run out of my stash. Next, I'm going to check on the spark arrestor screen to make sure it's not clogged with carbon, which would keep the engine from running at full speed. But as you can see, it has almost no buildup, which is great news. Now, a great way to prevent carbon buildup is to make sure that you use the trimmer close to full speed if possible. Next, I'm going to not only inspect the fuel filter, but I'm also going to replace the fuel lines as well because these will go bad over time. Now, because of the mismatching of fuel lines, I have this feeling that the person who was here last only changed the filter line but not the other one. Now, I have done this before, but I will let you know it really depends on the condition of the fuel lines. If they're really bad though, just replace both of them. So this was the fuel that was in the tank, and I hope you can see that brown bubble at the bottom. What you're seeing is a tiny amount of water, but I don't believe it's entirely at fault since this trimmer was running. And by the looks of the fuel filter, I do believe this was a brand new one installed from a kit. It's just too bad they didn't change out the other line as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with this other filter, however, I am going to swap it out for a larger and heavier filter instead. The main reason why is because with this style of fuel tank that's on this trimmer, the heavier ones seem to work a lot better. I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like the opening in the tank for the filter line was a bit mangled. More than likely they were having a tough time getting the line into the opening, so as a tip, cut the line at a sharp angle and use some long nose pliers to help out. That'll help keep you from destroying the openings while you try to install the lines and possibly causing a fuel leak later on. So I just realized something. If you recall, before I took the lines off, they had the black filter line connected to the return port, which is closer to the bulb, and the return line, which was unfiltered, connected to the bottom port, which is backwards from what it should be and not what you want. That's the reason why the screen inside the carb had debris on it. It was pulling in unfiltered fuel from the tank. So when connecting the fuel lines to the carb, the filter line connects to the lower port while the return line goes to the port near the bulb. Now, to check and make sure the lines are connected the right way, we're going to put some fuel into the tank and then purge the air from the system. So when pressing the bulb, fuel should fill up the filter line, go through the carb, then it'll fill up the bulb, and then leave the carb through the return line and go back to the tank. And as you can see, the fuel traveled through the lines and bulb just like they're supposed to, which is great news. Now, if there's no fuel making it to your bulb, then there's either a problem with your fuel filter or something inside the carb is keeping the fuel from moving through it. I was also able to clean the air filter that came out of this trimmer by using a degreaser, but if you don't want to mess with it, then just buy a new one. Now, more than likely, we're going to need to make some adjustments to the carb to get it to run. Now, the screw that's near the engine is for low speed fuel adjustment and is mainly used to get the engine to stay running, while the screw near the air filter is for high speed fuel adjustment, or basically while the trigger is fully squeezed. Now, in the last video, I mentioned that the rope seemed to be at least a foot too short, so before we try and start this trimmer, I'm going to take the recoil off and replace the rope for a longer one. I know that a lot of the comments mentioned that they didn't mind having a short pull rope, but the problem isn't the length, but the chance to damage the recoil. Because pulling on the rope until it stops at its full length could eventually break it, and the cost to replace it is about $20 depending upon where you order it from. So I'm going to show you what happens when you're not careful. Do not pull on the rope without the white plastic piece gone from the recoil. Otherwise, that's going to happen. The spring will free itself, and if you're not ready, it could hit you in the face. So I should have known better, but it goes to show you that even I can make mistakes. Fortunately, I was wearing my safety glasses, which I do recommend. So after cleaning the spring, I'll then remove the short rope from the pulley, the rear cover, and the handle. After that, I'll make sure the new rope is at least a foot longer. Now, if for some reason you don't like jump scares, then just buy a new recoil because it'll come with a new rope already installed. But if you do choose to replace the rope, then just be aware of the size of the rope you're going to use. If the rope is a lot thicker than the old one, then you might have a problem of not enough room on the pulley, and it also could bind up as well. So could you use a smaller rope than the old one? You sure could, but the rope might not be strong enough to do its job. Now, this part was easy, at least compared to what we have to do next, which is to wind the spring back up and carefully install it back into the pulley. For this very reason, I would almost recommend that you just buy a new recoil instead. If you've never done this before, you're going to see why I'm telling you this. This part is going to hurt your hands, and if you're not careful, you could also lose an eye, so please wear some eye protection. So after getting the pulley back in the cover, you'll need to carefully wind the spring back up by holding down the pulley with one hand. And with the other hand holding the rope, turn the pulley at least several times or just enough turns to get all the rope into the recoil. After that, slowly pull on the rope to make sure that it's going to work, and if you have some rope left out of the cover, you can either put more turns on the pulley or make the rope shorter. Now once you're happy with it, then put the rest of the recoil back together and then install it back onto the trimmer. Once the recoil is on, we can then purge the system again, choke the carb, and then try starting it. Well, it looks like it's running a whole lot better, but we did need to make some adjustments to get it there. So what exactly did I have to do for this particular trimmer to get it running a whole lot better then? Well, the engine speed was just a bit too high, so I could have just turned out the idle set screw. Instead, I opted to increase the fuel at idle, which will slow down the engine as well. Next, we needed to make sure it was running well at full throttle, but after squeezing the trigger, you could tell it needed an adjustment as well. So while holding the trigger down, we then turned the high-speed screw until we found where the engine speed was at its highest. Then, to make sure the engine didn't overheat, we then turned the high-speed screw counterclockwise just a little bit. So what exactly happened to this trimmer then? Well, because of the condition of the diaphragm, it would appear they left fuel in the trimmer while in storage. Now, this is not recommended for that very reason, and it could also clog up the tiny passages in the carb. The other issue that we found was that the fuel lines were installed backwards, and although it didn't cause our problem, if left like that and running, it would eventually cause the engine to not start as well. Now, the main culprit was the lack of maintenance, and that was made very clear when looking at the air filter. So what was the grand total for all the parts we used on this trimmer then? Well, the metering diaphragm was only 70 cents, the purge bulb was only 10 cents, the fuel line was about $1, and the rope was about 20 cents. That means the grand total was only $2, which I have to admit is not a bad investment at all. So my question is, do you think it was worth the time and money to save this trimmer, or do you think I should have just thrown it away and bought a new one instead? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.